English Literature Studies. Hey there, welcome back to English Literature Studies. In this particular video, we are going to look at the forms of poetry. Basically, these forms of poetry are based on the poet's preservation of his material. The forms of poetry depend on the preservation of the material of the poetry, as how the poet deals the material of the poetry. There are 4 forms of poetry: dramatic poetry, narrative poetry, lyric poetry, epic poetry, and didactic poetry. The dramatic poetry is objective in nature. In this specific poetry, the poet lets the characters speak their own story. The dramatic monologue is an example of dramatic poetry. Lyrical poetry. The lyrical poetry is subjective in nature, and it is accompanied with a musical instrument. For example, ode, elegy, and sonnet are examples of lyrical poetry. Narrative poetry. In a narrative poetry, the poet tells a story in a poetic way. Epic poetry is a long narrative poem that deals with the heroic actions and events with an involvement of supernatural elements. The epic poetry is a long narrative poem that deals with the heroic actions of the protagonist. At last, didactic poetry or didactic poetry. The basic purpose of didactic poetry is to teach moral to the audience. So, at the end of a didactic poetry, there is a moral for the audience. That's all about forms of poetry in this video. We have briefly discussed these forms of poetry just to let you know how the division of forms of poetry is based on the preservation of the material. Thank you so much for watching English Literature Studies.